I want to welcome you back into the Tell Me Short series. And today we're going to be looking at the obstacles to faith. The obstacles to faith. That's exactly the subject we're going to be looking at. And I want to draw your attention to the book of Exodus chapter 3 and as well as Exodus chapter 4. Now, these are two long passages that we're going to be looking at briefly here, and that is Exodus chapter 3, verses 10 to 22, and Exodus chapter 4, 1 to 17. And what I want to talk to you about is the obstacles to faith or the faith barriers. God enables us to carry out his plan for our life. That's what he does. When we fall short of accomplishing the goals he has set for us, it is not because he is in some way failed to provide the necessary equipment that we need, because that is not true. Instead, I want you to understand what failure is. Failure is usually the result of an obstacle within the heart. Failure is the result of an obstacle that's within our heart, and that's what I want you to understand. Okay, it's an attitude that short circuits our faith, if you will. And as a result, the flow of God's power is hindered, and we cannot become the person that he desires us to be. Moses is a dramatic example of what we're talking about here. And I want you to understand that, because it is a dramatic illustration of the disruptive potential of faith barriers and obstacles that come into our life. He was called to be one of the greatest missions, to one of the greatest missions in all of the scriptures. The future leader responded with what? What did Moses respond with? He responded with excuses after excuses after excuses as to why he should not obey. Does that sound like does that not sound like to us today? Does it not? Well, excuses for disobedience is what I want you to understand. Haven't changed much since Moses' encounter with the burning bush, if you remember that. He tried to hide behind the same kinds of excuses, the same kinds of obstacles, the same kinds of faith barriers that believers continue to cite and quote today. For example, he talked about having a poor self-image, okay? We see that in Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. He talked about ignorance about God. We see that in Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 to 21. He talked about self-doubt, if you recall that. Self-doubt. And we can see that in Exodus chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. He talked about feelings of inadequacy. Okay? We can see that in Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 to 11. And then he talked about the fear of failure. Okay? And we see that in Exodus chapter 4, verses 12 and 13. Let me show you this. In the first excuse or obstacle or barrier that he created was what we call self-image. Okay? This is the first. It's a poor self-image. Look at this with me in Exodus chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. He says, "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?' And he said, 'Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain.'" Now notice what he says in verse 11. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" He had a self-poor image. How many people have that? Then remember, the second excuse was what we call ignorance, right? The ignorance about God, right? He claimed to be completely ignorant about God, even though he heard the voice of God. Let me show you this. In Exodus chapter 3, look at verses 13 to 21. I want you to see this very, very carefully, because we have the exact same problems today. It has not changed much whatsoever. In verse 13, he says, "Then Moses said to God, 'Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them?'" He's claiming to be ignorant. "What shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent you." God furthermore said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all the generations." Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has appeared to me, and saying, I am indeed conquered about you what has been done to you in Egypt. And I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt into the land of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite to the land flowing with milk and honey. They will pay heed to what you say, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, the Lord, the God of Hebrews, has met with us. So now, please let us go let us go a 3 days journey with the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after they will let you go. And then he says in verse 21, I will grant the people forever in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. So God eliminated all the ignorance of who he was to Moses. So he eliminates the issue of a poor self-image. He eliminates the issue of the ignorance of God. And then we have the third major excuse that Moses came up with, which is the one that we come up with, is self-doubt. Self-doubt. We come up with this one, self-doubt. Listen to this. In Exodus chapter 4, the next chapter, verses 1, this was one relentless excuse after another, after another. Does it not sound just like us today? So here's the third major excuse or faith barrier or obstacle. It is self-doubt. In Exodus chapter 4, look what he says in verse 1. Then Moses said, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. And the Lord answered and said in verse 2, what is it that is in your hand? And he said, a staff. And he said, throw it to the ground. So he threw it to the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. And he showed him this great, incredible amount of power. Look what he says in verse 4. But the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand and grasp it by its tail. So he stretched out his hand, he caught it, and it became a staff in his hand all over again. That they may believe that the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. The Lord furthermore said to him, now put your hand into your bosom. So he put his hand into his bosom, right? So he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous, was white, leprous like snow, right? Then he said, put your hand into your bosom again. So he put it back in. So he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out of his bosom, behold, it was stored like the rest of his flesh. If they will not believe you or heed the witness of the first sign, they may believe the witness of the last sign. But if they will not believe even though these two signs or heed what you say, then you shall take some of the water from the Nile and pour it into the dry ground, and the water which you take from the Nile will become blood on the ground. We can see this very, very clearly, right? So he eliminates, self-doubt. He eliminates a poor self-image. Right? He eliminates the ignorance of God. And then we got this other one, right, that people always come up with, which is a feeling of inadequacy, right? People have this feeling of inadequacy. I don't feel I'm equipped. I don't feel I'm adequate enough. We hear this all the time. Well, look at this in Exodus chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. Look at what Moses says. He says in verse 10, 11, Exodus chapter 4, he's talking about his feelings of inadequacy. Then Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf, or seen or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Feelings of inadequacy. It's not about you. It's about what he does through you. And then here's the fifth major excuse that we come up with, or the fifth major obstacle to our faith, which is what? The fear of failure. The fear of failure. Look what he says in Exodus chapter 4, verses 12 and 13. He says, now then go, and he goes, then now go, and even I will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to say. But he said, please, Lord, listen to Moses, but please, Lord, now send the message by whomever you will. He was afraid of failing. Each time that Moses protested, each time that the Lord had asked, right, that the Lord had asked the wrong person, that's what he was saying. God, you got me confused with somebody else. I'm not the person. I'm not the person you want to use. Right? That's what he was saying. He was saying. He said he had a slow tongue. He was a shepherd of slavery lineage, right? Right? Who murdered a man and became a fugitive. God responded with a firm, persuasive rebuttal, each and every time. He just came up with all kinds of excuses. You have to understand that the theme of God's answer is something all believers need to really, really understand, just as Moses finally did. Namely, that when we are called to serve, our strength, our skill, our wisdom do not matter. Our strength, our skills, and our wisdom do not matter. He doesn't seek out the most qualified person for a particular job, but instead calls men and women who are willing to surrender themselves to him. When his strength works through their weaknesses, it is obvious that only God could have achieved the results that he could have achieved in their lives. What other conceivable excuse can you and I come up with? What other conceivable excuse can you and I come